Well, good morning, everyone. We're glad you're here today. We're going to teach a little bit this morning about discipleship from the book that you're going through on Jesus is Still Making Disciples Today. And I want to talk about Jesus' discipleship program. One of the things that we learn from his program is that he didn't invent discipleship. He wasn't the first to do discipleship. John the Baptist had disciples. Some of his disciples became disciples of Jesus. Jesus talked to the Pharisees and said he called them disciples of Moses. And so the idea of a disciple was primarily a student, a learner, someone who learned and then did what they were taught in order to really learn, to really go deep in what they were being taught. And so John the Baptist's disciples, they did what John did to become what John became. And it wasn't just a Christian concept. Philosophers had disciples, and what they would do is they would get this concept or some kind of revelation. They'd go to a cave and fast and get this concept or come into some kind of power. And then people would come to them and say, we want what you have. And he said, well then, if you want what I have, you have to do what I did. So the disciples would go to a cave and they would fast until they had some kind of spiritual experience. And they would then collect their own disciples, and they would say, I'm a disciple of so-and-so, and that's their renown. That's what makes them famous. And so discipleship existed before Jesus. And even today in Eastern religions, there's a discipleship concept where a guy has a certain philosophy, and people will join themselves to that man, dress like him, do whatever he did, live the way he lives, so that they can become what he became. And so there's a real sense where discipleship is really about imitating. And that's the word follow. When Jesus said, follow me, he was saying, imitate me. Do what I did. Do what I do, so you can become what I've become. And today in our culture, we really don't have anything quite like ancient discipleship. There really isn't anything. Higher education really isn't exactly it. I think the closest thing that we've ever had in this country, and we see it quite a bit in Europe, is a thing called apprenticeship, where you would be assigned by your parents, or you would go to a man who's a shoemaker or a carpenter, and you would say, how much will it cost for me to be taught by you, to learn a trade? And he'd say, well, you need to do this for 3 years. You need to be here. You need to live in the loft or live in the barn, and I'll tell you everything that you must do. And then that man, who's the disciple, can say, I was an apprentice to this person for 3 years, and he can go and open his own business, and then he would collect his own apprentice. And people would say, how much is it going to cost me to be your apprentice? And so you didn't get paid, you had to pay. And so this was very much in Europe and sometimes in early America. But there really isn't much today that we can say this is a pure example of what discipleship looks like. The other thing about discipleship that's really important is when you read the New Testament, Jesus would say things like, you cannot be my disciple unless you forsake all and follow me, unless you hate your parents and love me. He didn't use the word hate in the sense of being venomous and foaming at the mouth kind of hatred. He was talking about an order, a priority of love and loyalty. And he was saying, you have to put me above your parents. And that was one of the costs of discipleship. There were conditions on discipleship. Jesus actually turned away people who wanted to be his disciple. But so often we interchange the word disciple with Christian, or a disciple with believer. Well, there's a difference between being a believer and being a disciple. Jesus would preach the gospel and invite people to come into the kingdom, to accept the kingdom. The kingdom is close. The kingdom is at hand. Reach out, take it. And it's easy to become a believer. You become a believer by believing. And it doesn't get any easier than the thief on the cross who turned a little bit toward Jesus, and Jesus turned all the way toward him. He said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus looked at him and said, this day you'll be in paradise with me. It's actually easy to become a believer. You become a believer by believing. But to become a disciple is challenging, is difficult. It's going to require effort. It's going to require discipline. It's going to require complete focus. And Jesus would say things like, you cannot be my disciple unless you forsake everything and follow me, imitate me, go where I go, do what I do. So there's a cost and there is a condition on discipleship that wasn't on being a believer. But if we ever get those two things mixed up, we're in deep theological trouble, and the Bible's not going to make sense to us. And a lot of people use those words interchangeably. But here's what I've found out. I've discovered through pastoring people and working with people that all disciples are believers, but not all believers are disciples. There are people in our churches who don't do any of the things that Jesus did, and we can't clearly call them disciples. Are they believers? Do they believe in Jesus? Will they go to heaven? Absolutely. Should we care for them? Yes. We should pastor them. We should feed them. They're his sheep. We should look after them. But as far as me spending time and prioritizing my life around people, where I want to give all my attention, what I want to put all my energy into, most of my day is spent around discipleship. I'm creating materials. I'm meeting with people. I'm taking people with me where I go, who I think really want to follow Jesus in a way that would be more like a disciple. And so it's a matter of priority. Amen.